Peg Fong is an award-winning journalist and instructor. She's created the podcast Alone Together. Welcome, Peg.
Thanks, Anita. Happy to be here.
Peg, I know the pandemic and your students at Langara were the inspiration for this podcast. Tell us why.
You know, I think we can all remember in the middle of March, for me, it was March 12th, when everything began shutting down. And I had a number of students both at Langara and at KPU, where I also teach, and they felt completely lost. They were sitting at their computer and we were telling them, you have to go home. We're going into lockdown. You have to leave the campus.
Peg Fong is an award-winning journalist and instructor. She's created the podcast Alone Together. Welcome, Peg.
Thanks, Anita. Happy to be here.
Peg, I know the pandemic and your students at Langara were the inspiration for this podcast. Tell us why.
You know, I think we can all remember in the middle of March, for me, it was March 12th, when everything began shutting down. And I had a number of students both at Langara and at KPU, where I also teach, and they felt completely lost. They were sitting there at their computer and we were telling them, you have to go home. We're going into lockdown. You have to leave the campus. And I remember a couple of students telling me they didn't know where to go, that they didn't know what they should be doing here. They had come here to go to school, and they were completely lost, and they really feared being isolated from the community that they had. And so a couple of weeks later, when I was thinking about this, and I thought, you know, I've been writing about loneliness, I've been writing about isolation for many years as a journalist, and I thought I wanted to find a way to be able to tell them that even though we may be apart physically, that they weren't alone, and that there were ways that people can still connect all over the world. And they were really, for me, the inspiration behind why I wanted to do a podcast about how we can connect.
Such a good and important reminder. You are looking at the condition of isolation for all sides. What are your biggest takeaways from your season 1?
You know, we're now in season 2. We started on September the 10th. We're in our 3rd episode. We have a new episode coming out every Friday. And what I found was that the way that we have been able to talk about loneliness and isolation has changed. And I think that's one of the things that the pandemic has enabled us to do, is to be able to acknowledge that many of us are alone, and acknowledge that there is a loneliness that has become part of our culture and part of our society. And so what I found, some of the biggest takeaways for me, is that there's lessons that we can learn from loneliness in so many different ways. We can learn it through the music that we listen to, through art, through history, through science, which is my background, but also mainly through how people can connect with each other. And when we do have those connections, there are lessons that we can learn from that. And so those, for me, are the biggest takeaways.
And can you give some examples of those?
You know, we had our first episode launched, which was about the loneliness of celebrities, and how being famous is not a way that people are immune to being lonely. And what I have found in talking to people, and each of the episodes, they're journalistic. We interview people from around the world who have unique stories to tell us about loneliness. We have an episode coming up about the loneliest whale, and a bird that hadn't been seen in 170 years. And it was found when people were in isolation in Indonesia, and people were still not able to see it because people were in lockdown. So after waiting 170 years to find this bird, it appeared, it showed up, and they had to kind of release it back back into its habitat, which is a good thing, rather than keep it in a cage so that people could see it. So there are little lessons that I think we can all learn about isolation and loneliness, and all of them have in some ways been inspiring for me. We did an episode about how artificial intelligence might be a way for us to learn about the language of loneliness, that even if we don't say, I am lonely, how are the ways that we speak? What are the ways that we communicate with each other that tell us something that maybe we're not ready to say out loud, that I am lonely?
Such important conversations. I know for myself, sometimes I do have that thought in my head, you know, I'm feeling lonely today, and it's hard to vocalize because you think that you're the only one. So it's so key to have these conversations and make sure that everyone knows that they're not alone. What are you trying to achieve in season 2?
In season 2, I think we are really building on some of those stories that we have been hearing and the ways that we can connect with each other can be in small ways. Sometimes we tackle big topics, like we tackled about China's one-child policy and how it has created perhaps the loneliest country in the world. But we also want to do even smaller stories, and maybe stories that are a little bit more intimate and maybe related to pop culture. I have an exciting episode. I'm very excited about this one, is whether we can smell loneliness. Is there a scent of loneliness that we give off? And I talked to experts, and there is a smell of loneliness. And scent was so important to so many of us because people who did get COVID remarked about how they had this loss of smell and they weren't able to smell the things that they were used to. And that created a lot of loneliness. We have an episode coming up about why reading is a way that we can understand the loneliness of what it is to be a creator, if you're a writer, and why we read when we're feeling lonely and what it can tell us. And another episode about what athletes have to teach us about loneliness.
That's fascinating. I don't think anybody would equate loneliness with smell. What does it say about our society that we have so much chronic isolation?
Well, I think and I think it goes to our title. Our title is Alone Together, A Curious Exploration of Loneliness. When I was talking to the team who we're working with to create this show, and it has gone international, was that one of the things that we didn't want to do was to talk about loneliness in a way where people don't get something out of it. It should be a curious understanding of why we have this loneliness and why it is chronic in our society today. People have talked about loneliness for a long, long time, but I think there's so many things that is happening to us as a society, buoyed by the pandemic has played a big role in that, about why we do feel lonely. But what I'm hoping with the show is that people are able to say, there's something that I can take out of loneliness, and there are ways that I can give back, there are ways that I can connect with others, because there are even people who may be lonelier than I am. And I think if anyone who feels lonely, and I think we all do feel lonely at times, some of us feel it all the time, some of us feel it on occasion, but there are, I think, things that we can learn from each other about what we can do to understand loneliness and how we can share it so that people who may not be ready to share it yet are able to hear and to hear some of the stories that we have.
So it sounds like you've done a lot of research around the why, but what about a cure? Is loneliness something that we can cure, or do you think that it's with us forever and maybe that's okay?
I think it is. I don't think we'll ever find an answer to, if you do this, then you will not be lonely. But I think there are perhaps little lessons along the way that we can understand, why physical touch matters and why it might make us feel lonely, and why if we're feeling perhaps bored or we don't know what to do with ourselves, there are little steps that we can take. And some of it is grounded in science, and some of it is just how it is that we can take little things that we understand about being alone, and then maybe it is opening it up and sharing it. If I feel lonely, maybe you feel lonely too, and maybe that is the best way that we can start having these connections again. One of the things, you say I'm a teacher, I came back face to face with a lot of my students this term, and one of the things that I really learned was that we do have to learn how to reconnect. We do have to learn how to socialize again and talk face to face with people. That's not going to be easy, but I think all of us have learned so much out of the pandemic that it is for us to take some of the lessons away from it and to reach out to people and to share some of our stories and to understand, we are really alone together.
And we will try to remember that on days that we are feeling lonely. Peg Fong is an award-winning journalist and instructor. She's created the podcast Alone Together. Thank you, Peg.
Thanks so much, Anita.
Whoa! Hey, Jesus, man. Why don't you watch where you're going, eh? What was that? You heard what I said.
What? You want to start some shit?
And what's your language too, eh?
Oh, piss off. Quit.
Yeah. Right.
Keep walking, dickhead.
I'll get you another one, all right?
Okay, but tell that guy he owes me $4.
$4?
Yeah,
He does, doesn't he?
yeah.
I'll get it off him later, all right?
Okay.